welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone that's attended this particular event. We apologize for some of the technical delays, but we've obviously been able to correct those. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have an interactive webinar on practical regulatory compliance software testing. My name is Reg Struck from Chlorine Software, and I will be your host and moderator for today's event. Today's format with this webinar will be an introduction of our guest speakers, a roundtable discussion on related topics to regulatory and compliance issues, and finally, we'll have a brief introduction to Chlorine QA. With today's discussion, it'll be a roundtable. It's totally an open forum. All questions that are addressed to the panelists will be via our WebEx Q&A, and we'll try to address those questions. Please be patient, though, as we attempt to answer all of your questions. Note also that this session will be recorded. Open forum, WebEx. Bios of our speakers. We have three great thought leaders in today's session. I'd like to start with Griffin Jones. He's a compliance and regulatory guru specializing in regulatory for medical and pharma industries. Welcome, Griffin.
Thank you.
Then we have Karen Johnson, testing consultant, co-founder of REST, which is the workshop on regulated software testing. And Karen is an expert in context-driven concepts for testing. Hi, Karen.
Morning.
And then finally, we have John Maconda, testing guru and expert, also a co-founder of REST, and an instructor for the Association for Software Testing and a senior partner at Moser Consulting. Welcome all of our guests.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
This will start the roundtable discussion in which our panels will initiate each topic, followed by an open discussion through our WebEx Q&A feature, and each topic will be allocated a minimum of at least 10 minutes before we move on to the next topic. Let's begin. The first topic, can we test only with pre-written test cases? Why is this important to have the ability to write test case on the fly? Or do we write them at all? I pass it over to our guest speakers.
I think this is one of the most controversial parts of it. And I think a lot of the thoughts are changing, at least from my experience. But when I was in the most tightly regulated environment, it was just the standard that we had to write everything out before we tested it. So you had some smart person somewhere that wrote out all the test cases, and then the idea was, well, we'll dumb them down for anybody to execute them, and we'll make sure that we pass every regulation because of that. So no room for error, basically. In my experience, I've found that is very limiting, though. It's something that you can cross off a checkbox to show that you passed the regulation, but as far as actually testing the product, it's a very limited scope, and that sometimes a lot of bugs can get through because of that.
That's a good point, John. In my experience also, there was also people would tend to do the additional testing also, but they felt badly about not following a script per se. So often people would do that on the fly, on the side, but not use that as documentation to show that they were actually complying with the regulatory requirements, because the quality systems or the standard operating procedures of the organization were written in such a way that it appeared that the regulation and the SOPs wouldn't allow you to follow non-scripted procedures.
Right. And something we did, we actually wrote that into our SOP. So we would have everything defined exactly how we were going to do it, but then we had a clause that said we reserve the right to do additional testing that does not fall into this. And that was kind of our exploratory loophole that let us kind of be free with those types of tests.
I want to jump in on that. So what a terrible thing to have to be free to test something well, right? Like I don't think that was ever really the intention. I think what happened is some regulations were written, and I think they've been interpreted such that we all feel very frozen, and we're not thinking really well when we feel that the only way we can test is by a pre-written script and tell people exactly what to do. Because if you do that, then allegedly you have evidence of having tested something, but all you have evidence of is that you've executed the test scripts. And I was kind of mortified to find that there's actually a way to actually even get around that. So I'm not even sure if it really gives you that sense of assurance. But I'd like to talk about this problem a little bit from a different angle. One is that when you have a product and it has documentation and it says it will do this or it shall do that or it must do this, those sort of key verbs you look for in a requirements doc, and a lot of regulated products are still written by requirement docs. The inclination is to have a test script per each one of those so that you can sort of check it off. And I know later in this session we'll talk about checking versus testing. And I think that's part of it. I think part of it is we feel like, well, we've got to check everything off, and that body of work, that creating all those test scripts ahead of time and actually executing them takes up so much labor, and we've become so focused on passing the audit. But we should really ask ourselves, are we comfortable that we've tested the product, and get some of the fear away from the audit, and the fear to be more, is the product really ready to be used? And that's where I think we've strayed.
Yeah, I like that example that you gave, Karen. And the fear of the audit, I think, really comes down to not so much a fear of the auditors, because when you actually interact with them, they're actually fairly reasonable and understanding. But I think it comes down to a fear of being able to present reasonable evidence and make the audit go easy. And there's a balance that gets out of whack between doing good testing but not being able to explain it well, or not being able to generate simplistic documentation and evidence that proves that you did it well, versus doing weak testing, quite frankly, but which is really easy to explain and can show very strong traceability back to requirements.
Yeah, I agree, but I wouldn't want people listening to think, oh, if you take a look at the bios of these three people, they happen to all be, hardcore exploratory testers. There is a way to blend both scripts and exploratory testing together, and I know John has experience with that. And I think we should talk about that, because I think when you take any practice that you've been doing and you try to swing it to another end of the pendulum, it's uncomfortable, right? Change is really uncomfortable, and I think there is a way to blend it, and I think we should talk about that, because I think that's much more likely to happen in environments versus doing one extreme or the other.
Completely agree.
Right.
John, did you have an example?
Yeah, as I kind of mentioned before, in my experience, we started with just prewritten. And what happened with us was we were in one vertical market, which was more of a consumer product. It wasn't pharma world. But then we started getting into the pharma world, so all of our processes had to change. And when we first started, it was pre-scripted test cases. But the more that I researched and my teammates researched, we realized, well, bugs were slipping through. What else is out there? We saw exploratory testing. So we had a very common tool, which is Mercury Quality Center. Now it's HP. And we were able to adapt that to our use. So we did have pre-scripted test cases. We had a fairly large regression suite of test cases, and they were all manual. We did those in the HP Quality Center, but then we had written in our SOPs that we could do exploratory testing as well, and that was part of the process. So if anyone asked, well, what do you have for exploratory testing, the evidence was different. We had plenty of evidence for exploratory testing, but we didn't say that we did pre-written test cases for those, so it wasn't a problem with the auditors. I think that was the key. As long as we said up front that this is what we're doing, I think the auditors were fine with it in our case.
I had somebody I worked with once explain it to me this way. You have to do everything you said you were going to do, but no one said you couldn't do more. Right?
I like that.
So if you've tested something by way of a script and along the way you see something else and you think, gosh, I should go investigate that, maybe you finish your script, and again, this goes back to trying to blend both practices. Maybe you finish your script, but then you follow up and say, let's go back and do another session. Let's see what we can see. I think part of the problem with scripts, and John alluded to this in the beginning, is it separates the thinking from the testing. I think that's really the problem. It's not so much that scripts in and of themselves have no value, but you think through the process of what you need to test, and you create these scripts, and then if somebody else comes along and executes them, and John said it well, we often create these scripts in a way that, quote-unquote, anybody can come in off the street and execute. So right there, as soon as you use that phrase, you're saying, okay, we're going to separate the thinking here. We've got somebody who knows the product, and they're going to write this script, and somebody else who's probably at a lower bill rate, potentially located somewhere else, they're going to execute. We're not asking them to think. They're a machine, and we just want them to execute these things. And I think when you see that behavior, I think the next inclination is, well, you might as well automate it. And if there's no thinking going on, you might as well automate it. So once you detach testing from the whole thinking process, you don't really have a brain-engaged tester. And actually, you've asked them not to do that. You've asked them to follow exact steps and to follow a script and to complete that. And in regulation, a lot of times we even ask for screenshots, like prove that you actually follow this exactly. And I don't know why we'd really want to separate the thinking.
I think it's a really good point about keeping.
Created a reaction.
Go ahead, John.
We have a great comment here from one of our audience members. What about pre-written test cases for the core functionality and then screen-recorded exploratory testing? As long as you have a disk space, you can show what has been tested.
I'm doing a thumbs up over here.
And
so
in
we're
fact,
all in agreement?
That ties into the way I usually do it, where I have fairly tight scripts around the high-risk feature functionality or pieces of products if there's safety issues potentially, where I want the person who is aware of the dangers or the criticality of the functionality to a patient to put thought into a script and make sure that the person who executes that particular script is actually executing it. But for things that are not quite of that degree of criticality, I really like using screen recordings and miking up my testers, and I will record the entire test session during that point in time. Movies and recordings of what people actually do is a lot stronger evidence of what actually happened as opposed to a printed sheet with a stack of screenshots with a pre-recorded script of what they allegedly did. So that tends to be my approach. When I've shown it to other external auditing people who's looked at my particular processes, they've been thrilled by it.
And I think that's getting easier as well. There's a lot of tools out there for that. If you have Quality Center, they have a plugin just for that, and it'll record videos of whatever you're doing. There's also Blueberry Test Assistant, and that's a fairly cheap license. I don't remember exactly what it costs. But then the other one is Camtasia. So those are the top three that I can think of, but they range from, buying it with Quality Center, which is a huge investment, but you can also get cheap tools just to record.
Absolutely.
I actually don't. I don't typically do that. What I find for a lot of people is being recorded really creates this sort of unnatural event where they feel uncomfortable. I mean, if you do it long enough and you do it often enough, you can get comfortable with it and you can just ignore it in the background. But I don't see any issue with doing exploratory testing sort of the old-fashioned way, right? I like to leave Notepad up and running and I take notes of what I'm doing. And if I'm in a regulated environment and I find something that really needs to be talked about or I think I've got an issue, there's no reason why I can't capture stronger notes on that and handle it in other ways. So I think there's a lot of ways to blend it. And I think, again, going back to what John said, you really have to look at your SOPs, right? Whatever you write into your practice. I was amazed to learn that to say what you're going to do it, and then prove it is harder than it would sound. And you can make all these obligations early on in a test plan about we're going to do this, this, and this, and run into issues in executing that make some of it more challenging than you would think. So I think when you write out a test plan and you commit something for an audit point of view, you should be really careful what you write. Don't kind of, this sounds terrible, but don't really offer up any more than you need to offer up, but then feel free to go ahead and do really robust testing and really full reporting at the end of the whole cycle.
That's a really good point.
We have another question from the audience, from Philip Hoban. Can someone explain what is the added value, or how would an auditor value test session recordings? You can show what someone did, but what information can be derived from this, which is understandable for an auditor?
When I would use recordings, I'm working off a charter. The charter often has linkages back to specific requirements. So in those particular cases, it's just strong evidence. The recordings themselves are strong evidence of what exactly really happened when that particular piece of feature functionality was evaluated, that those particular requirements were checked and were found to be either passing or failing, for example, some form or fashion. And it just provides stronger evidence than a normal set of screenshots that perhaps have annotations on them or even notes. Just because I take recordings doesn't mean that I don't take notes. I prefer to take notes and screenshots, but I supplement that eventually with the recordings as the final backup. I like recordings personally because it relieves me of my anxiety and my test team's anxiety about how well we're taking notes, the ultimate notes, and summarizations of what's going on while we're doing testing. It just relieves the burden of the record keeping from the tester and keeps them in the flow of doing the testing.
So, Griffin, my background is in journalism, right? So I started out as a tech writer. So I've come to recognize that for me to keep notes while I'm testing is probably a lot more natural than it may be for other people. So I think you have to figure that out. What really works.
I'm suggesting a way as opposed to the way.
Yeah.
And I realize that my particular method often inhibits some of the testing people that I have working for me. At one level, I'm okay with that. But if someone can propose something that meets my particular needs and it's regulatorily compliant and and makes it easier for them to work, I'm quite open to alternative methods. I make sure my SOPs are written in such a way that it allows you to do that.
I think the question makes a good point, though. I think it's hard to see thinking.
When I mic up my testers and they're doing testing as opposed to checking, I ask them to explicitly explain as they're going along what are they doing and why are they doing it. And that sort of at least creates a shadow of what the thinking is that's going inside their head as they're doing a test execution, some degree of exploration of those particular requirements, and eventually coming to some conclusion or an assertion of a conclusion about feature functionality or requirements.
One final question before we move on to the next topic, because we are regulated by time. Dan asks, what arguments can we make to the customer to use exploratory testing in place of some of the scripted tests?
I think it can be hard to explain why you can go through and test a product completely by scripts and yet still feel like there's issues left over and that there's testing yet to be done. And I guess one of the ways you could prove it after would be how you found the defects, like how you found the issues, right? Did you find it by way of a script? I was in a situation where every defect that was found had to be tied back to something. So you couldn't just, which seems sad, you couldn't just randomly find an issue with the product. You had to explain how you found that. Was it a test script or what were you doing? So that certainly can shore it up at the back end as far as trying to get that allowance in the front end. I think probably telling people that you're trying to do due diligence and you recognize that scripts might not have covered everything and you might think of other conditions when you're in there is probably another way to argue for it. John?
Yeah, we kind of did that too. We started out negotiating with the project manager to get just a little piece of the testing budget for exploratory testing, and that way we were able to prove ourselves as far as what kind of bugs we got, how many bugs, the quality of bugs, and also being able to pass the regulatory aspects as well. We were able to prove that this was good enough to keep adding more and more time to the project.
Yeah, my experience was also the rate of return, in terms of value of the exploratory was usually obvious to the particular client, the program manager or the external customer. If that was an issue, we would just say, let's try a small experiment and just try it out and see what happens. Usually customers are willing to take some small investment and try alternative methods if it sounds like there's reasonable payoff.
Okay, thank you. We have to move on to the next topic, unfortunately. Sure. And the next one's already up. It's about automation. And the first question would be, what kind of evidence are we looking for?
What we found with automation is, first of all, you need to think of an automation strategy without regulations, because even without regulations, automation I think is very difficult to get your return on investment. But automation adds this little wrinkle, especially with FDA, because when we worked with FDA, first of all, they had to validate the tool, generally. And when I was working with the Mercury tools, before they were bought by HP, but they published a certificate that said we are generically validated for FDA use. But even so, even if a tool has that, which I don't know that any actually do that anymore, they wanted us to validate the tool in our own environment. So we had to, every part of the regulation, we had to show how the tool would satisfy that. So One of those, of course, is objective evidence. That's usually the biggest stickler for an audit. So we had to show a manual test case, and we had to show the objective evidence there. Then we would automate it. Then we had to show that nothing changed as far as objective evidence. And they were even going down to the script level and saying, well, if you're going to automate a test, you have to do this with every test. You have to show us the manual version, automate it, and then show us the automated version. Now that's pretty strict, I think, and hopefully your auditors won't be quite that nasty about it. But that's what I found, and I hope that's probably the most extreme case.
In my experiences doing IQ, OQ, PQ install, and for both our internal systems and when I went and audited my suppliers, I wouldn't necessarily go down to that level. It would depend on the particular tool itself and whether or not the people are applying appropriate due diligence and thoughtfulness in terms of doing that assessment of whether or not the tool was installed correctly, whether it actually has the feature functionality and it actually appears to be appropriate for the problem, and whether they can actually use it in their production environment and generate valid results. That's the real purpose of the FDA's regulation around these types of tools and use of these tools. They want to confirm that people have used appropriate due diligence to confirm that the tools have the appropriate capabilities that people are relying on when they're doing the assessment. It's work, but once you get into a rhythm of qualifying these types of tools, it becomes a little easier. And ultimately, each individual organization needs to qualify the tool inside their own production environment or their own development environment. You can't rely on the external tool vendor to assert that the tool is qualified. That's not a valid assertion by the tool vendor. Each individual organization has a responsibility to qualify the tool in their own environment.
A comment about that is sometimes what I found was that the big expensive tools were challenging to kind of validate that the tool was working okay. So the good news to that was that we thought hard about maybe what we really want here is a utility or some kind of a small tool, or maybe we can grow it in-house ourselves. Or in some cases, it actually did, on the more negative end, it did stop us from using tools because having to validate the tool was such an additional burden on the whole process that sometimes we would have to think really hard about, is this even worth it? Griffin, I wanted to ask, I'm familiar with the terms, but I know a lot of people may or may not be, the IQ, OQ, PQ. Do you want to briefly mention what those are?
Yeah, essentially what they're saying is that you have to qualify the installation process, so installation, qualification, then you're qualifying whether or not the feature functionality, the production qualification, and IQ, OQ, let's do them in order. Installation qualification, so you're confirming that you can install it. Operational qualification, OQ, which is confirming that the feature functionality that's asserted by the vendor and that you're using, usually this is a confirmation of, against some type of publication, user pubs, or against a requirements document if you're lucky enough to have access to that. And then the last one is the most critical one, actually, which is production qualification, which is PQ, which is qualifying that tool in your environment on actual or simulated work that would be flowing through your process. So you made a really interesting point about big tools being hard to qualify in environments, Karen. And one way you deal with that is that if you're buying a big tool, you're not required to actually qualify all aspects of that particular tool. You can, from an IQ, OQ, PQ point of view, IQ, OQ, IQ, you got to install it. But you can focus the qualification on just those aspects of the tool that you're going to be using inside your R&D effort or in your production environment. And that can often, especially with the very big tools, make it simpler to qualify those particular products and get them to be used in production faster. Yeah,
that's a good point. When you mentioned PQ, one of the things that came to mind was data and how challenging it is in a regulated environment. It's challenging enough in other environments because it can be expensive to have a copy of production data, but imagine you're working with, like I have medical devices where, you'd love a copy of production data, but you'd be breaking lots of regulations to have access to some of this information. And I know I've worked with people who, maybe they work for the IRS, work with other regulations, and they can't have access to that. So I I think about data, I think about tools, and I think about some of the challenges in a regulated environment, and kind of both of those make me groan, because just when you thought they were hard enough in another environment, it's even more challenging. So
finding the data to send through for qualification is a challenge. You do the best you can, and if you can't do it in a reasonable fashion, then that becomes a problem. You might not be able to qualify the tool in that environment.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if people on the phone realize that we're all actually located in different cities right now and can't see each other. So, pardon me for stepping on you there, Griffin. John, did you want to say anything about the data?
Well, in my current context, it is very sensitive. So we have very extreme regulations on what we can do with the data. If we accidentally email what they call personally identifiable information, we have to file a report. It's a huge deal. So our data is very carefully kept on mainframes. We have to have somebody mine that data. So it's pretty strict.
Yeah, I thankfully don't have personally identifiable information in some of my current projects that I'm supporting. But yeah, going through and having a third party, not the test group, sanitize the data and provide and be that intermediary between where the data comes from and how it gets into the test organization, and as much as possible sanitizing or creating synthetic data is a huge benefit.
Question from the audience: is there a formula for calculating the cost to automate, or do you use one?
I've not used
I'm sorry,
one.
I missed the last part of that. Is there a formula for calculating the cost of
automation?
John, do you have an opinion on that?
I've seen a lot of jokes about that with some formulas that I probably wouldn't actually use, but it's I personally I don't really believe in such a thing. Honestly, there's too many variables, and again, this is something that's going to add to your cost. If you're looking for return on investment for a tool, you've got to factor this in. But yeah, there's so many variables to that that you have to consider. That I would like to see what your particular context looks like before I would think about any kind of formula. If you've got enough information there, then you might be able to calculate. And again, it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Is it bugs? Do we say, okay, we get 50 bugs out of 100 tests? Is that a good enough rate? Or is it regulations? Are we passing the regulations and it's saving us this amount of time? So there's a lot of factors that go into that, I think. But to have a specific formula that applies to all, I'm not so sure that's possible.
I tend to agree with you, John. I'd like to look at it on individual by individual basis. The best tools that I've seen, that I've worked and have personally worked with, have had just stunningly obvious return, and not so much on investment, but just on the time that people were going to be spending. They were often data management systems for quality records or other types of tools that gave the new capabilities to the test organization that allowed us to do performance testing that we would never have that capability to do through some other method. That's the way that I've often approached tools. And I've also been, quite frankly, I've been shaped in an early experience in my career where I bought a really big customized tool that was going to be a silver bullet. And when it failed spectacularly and was scrapped, that sort of pushed me to moving towards using smaller, simpler tools in general.
We have the comment, the more regression, the more ROI you get from automation. Any feedback on that?
About how you save money when you keep doing the same thing over and over? I don't know. I think I get a little skeptical, I guess, of some of it. I think too many times I've seen environments where, we have 600 automated tests, and then you quietly ask one of the testers, okay, that sounds like a lot. What does it do? And nobody in the group remembers anymore, and they just have to kind of maintain them and keep running them. I think regression should be a more thoughtful situation. It frustrates me that we just kind of continue to test products over and over and not continually ask what have we changed and what do we need to test this time for regression.
With regression, I see regression testing more as a change detection kind of function as opposed to, so I don't really want to see I don't want to put a huge investment in that, and I don't give it a lot of weight unless it tends to be failing all the time. If we're talking about tools that are supporting a TDD, a test-driven development environment, then I'd be very much more in favor of it. But I've worked in a couple of situations where eventually the regression effort consumed the test organization to such a point that it imperiled their ability to deliver new feature functionality over time.
I think that's what I'm thinking about.
Okay, great. We have to move on to the next topic, and that topic is regulated and agile. Why is AAMI important to testing?
So this could actually be fairly simple. So there's no real conflict between using agile development practices and testing methods and working in a regulated environment, particularly in the FDA. And if people get a chance, they should try to Google on a thing called the Guidance on the Use of Agile Practices in the Development of Medical Software that Amy's putting together. And it has some really interesting recommendations that are beginning to come out of it. It's still in a draft form, so you might have to go find the people on the committee and figure out who you would know between them. There are some public presentations that some of the committee members have publicly presented about some of the results of what the committee is putting together. But essentially it comes down to some simple recommendations where this group of thought leaders in FDA world, along with the FDA people, have essentially recognized that the agile values that can actually be adopted into FDA context, that they recognize that agile can actually work within the quality management systems. But they had some particular points that if you're going to use agile and or exploratory testing, what you need to do is you need to have strong change management in that environment, and you also need to have a very functioning quality management system that agile testing environment lives inside. So the point is, if you looked at like ISO, I think it's at 62304, the regulation that explains how to do iterative development in an FDA world. And if you look at this particular technical information report that's beginning to come in shape, that's being drafted, it indicates that the FDA is moving in the direction of explicitly endorsing iterative development practices.
Okay. And obviously the second bullet point, do your auditors actually care about waterfall versus agile?
So that's an really interesting point. So auditors do care if you're doing something that's not normal in the industry, and I wouldn't necessarily assert that using iterative development practices are normal in FDA world yet. So if you're doing something unusual and they haven't seen it before, you need to be able to articulate why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and how it's actually regulatorily compliant. So you need to think through that particular positioning and be able to demonstrate that you actually practice that and have evidence that shows that you're doing that. If you're able to do that, then most people are reasonable and will accept that you're doing something that's reasonable, an iterative development model. But if you aren't able to do that, then auditors in particular, because they're unfamiliar or generally unfamiliar with iterative development practices, will not give you credit for doing that, and they'll start to look with suspect at the rest of your particular testing efforts and test planning.
I've actually not worked with a regulated product that's been in an agile environment. I think there's a reason for that. I think it could work incredibly well. I don't see that there'd be any problem from a compliance or an audit point of view. I think it's just a comfort level in the industry. I think regulated environments seem to be a little bit behind other environments and need to sort of see it proven. But I'm sure that they're headed this way. I'm not sure if John's worked in that combination, but I personally haven't seen that combination, not yet.
No, I did some research for an article with people who have, and at our workshops that we'll talk about later, we've had some really strong presentations about regulated and agile. So I've heard really good stories about it working, but I'd be interested to try it sometime, just haven't been able to.
it can work. You just need to be able to present your information coherently to someone who has never necessarily seen it, and you need to tighten up your message, ideally so that you can present it in a short, succinct chunk.
Makes sense.
Okay, any other comments about regulations in Agile?
Not so much here. I'd love to hear if someone has one of the people listening has experience doing Agile or iterative development practices in some regulated field. I'd love to hear a question from them.
They should come to Rest.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's a good segue to a couple of slides from now. Okay, we'll move on, time permitting. All right, so our next topic is checking versus testing. Question I've always had is, what is the difference between checking and testing?
Excellent. If you had a chance, testing and checking is one of those things that's been fairly heavily talked about recently over, the last year and a half, I think it is, since Michael Bolton originally posted this particular point about making a distinction between testing a product versus checking a product. And it spawned quite a bit of other conversation inside the industry in general. And it's been a helpful metaphor, at least when I deal with my regulated folks, in terms of making the distinction between the different activities that we're doing in the testing and making a distinction about whether or not we're testing, if we're trying to gain new information about the product and the design, or whether we're doing checking, which is predetermined, usually requirements confirmation or requirements definition, or requirements demonstration, in that environment. So having the external references that sort of support this discussion is kind of helpful in framing the discussion internally with the organization.
Well, I worked with someone who told me a really sad story one time. They used Quality Center as well, and their manager kept asking them, well, why weren't you getting more stuff tested? And what he came up with was, well, they wrote some custom code in Quality Center to show all of their confirmation points. So what he was saying was, well, we're doing so much confirmation that nobody understands how much work we're doing, so they had thousands and thousands of confirmation points in their tests. And what these were, they were scripted tests that it was a step that said log into the application. Well, that was a confirmation point. And enter username was a confirmation point. That's not a test. That's just doing something to the application. But they were tracking all of these, and they were just proudly displaying all these confirmation points. But in reality, how much of that was testing? So I think that happens quite a bit, especially in the regulated world.
Yeah, no offense to our host, but I find that when people say they don't know what the difference is between checking and testing, it tells me something. It tells me that people think, or that individual thinks that testing is a matter of confirming that everything works. And I think we do get obsessive about that because we want to ship products to market. And regulated, we get obsessed about that because we're trying to prove something to an audit. But I think in other environments, we get focused that way because we want to ship. And I think we're forgetting that we need to test things, which sometimes means we need to beat up on the product a little bit so that we can find what the issues are before it goes live, before it gets in the customer's hand or a patient's hand. So I kind of want to go backwards just a second, which is I'm a big fan of Agile, but when I see testing in Agile environments where the only testing is focused on acceptance criteria and all of those points are happy path confirmation testing, I'm very uncomfortable.
That's a really good point. In my area, the checking has a lot of value because you need to do checking of requirements in order to demonstrate conformance to the FDA regulatory requirements around requirements confirmation. But that's not the end. That's merely the beginning in terms of there's lots of the other aspect of what the FDA really wants is they want you to proactively examine the risk of the product at any point in time and address risk. And that's what testing really is, which is I wonder what would happen if that things that are not necessarily explicitly described in documented requirements but should be assessed in some form or fashion. through testing. And good organizations that I've worked with understand that distinction and are always focused more on the testing aspects as opposed to the checking. And part of that is because they have a development and a project management environment that recognizes that and an expectation that we are going to be regulatorily compliant, and it's a basic table stakes expectation that requirements are checked and implemented correctly. And then the real focus of project management and the technical team is on addressing the testing and implicit requirements inside the product.
Griffin, that makes me think of something. In a regulated environment, a lot of times there's a document that people outside of regulation I don't think are familiar with at all, known as a traceability matrix. So you might have a requirement, you then map it to a test case to prove that you've tested that requirement. So I would imagine a question might be, well, if I leave my scripted test cases, how will I be able to prove it? And I don't see any issue why your traceability matrix couldn't point to an exploratory testing charter.
Absolutely.
And handle the mapping there.
I've done it in the past multiple times. The point is the higher requirement of a traceability matrix, from my understanding, is that essentially the agency wants evidence that the development process is under control, all the way from the creation of those requirements or discovery of those requirements through the design and architecture and implementation and confirmation checking of those requirements. And at the same time, they want risk assessed also through that process. And you need some degree of a piece of evidence to show that. And back in the day, when design controls first came out from the FDA, the simplest way to do that was through a table format, which very clearly showed that type of tracing. Nowadays, there's tools that can help you do that. But it's really important that people understand the purpose of why the traceability matrix exists or why it was put in place. And if you can address the purpose to some degree, we don't necessarily care about what the tool is that you use to accomplish that goal. I've seen people or projects get consumed with having to manage traceability of products and requirements through the entire process. And you want to avoid that.
Yeah, I saw a situation where we didn't even want to add more tests because the trace matrix was already really difficult to manage, and that's really sad. And to go back to the beginning of, test scripts, when you get in a mental mindset of building a test script that says, do this, then do that, and then get this expected result, that's also another way that keeps you from thinking about ways to break in more fully test software, because a lot of times, like you touched on it, Griffin, what if? That should be really what I'm thinking all day long as a tester. And if I'm thinking of these, conditions, what if, that generally means I don't know what the expected result is. Let's go investigate this product and let's go find out what it is. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine the discomfort when you're filling in a test script, that if you don't know what the expected result is, people sometimes think, well, then that's not a valid test. So that's another way that I think pre-written test scripts kind of inadvertently add to not thinking about testing robustly.
Mm-hmm.
Another great question from the audience. How important is it to show auditors real test documents, so not checks against requirements? Suppose you have only checks. Is there an issue?
If you only have checks as opposed to tests, auditors want to see raw data. That's the real evidence of what actually happened. If you only have checks, most auditors, if they're following FDA regulations, you have a requirement, you have some type of check that confirms that the requirement was designed and implemented, and then you have evidence that shows that. That will usually satisfy them, but is that while it may be technically regulatorily compliant, it doesn't necessarily address the risk issues. So you should always be thinking about that. If you go back in, I think IEEE published the Therac accident, and the long form of it was the entire analysis was about 80 pages. As you go through that analysis, at aspects of it, they were doing a lot of checking, but they were absolutely not doing any type of testing, at least the test group. And if you find yourself, as you read that, evaluate what the culture or make some assumptions about what the culture was like in that organization. Think about what that looks like or smells like, and be aware of what those particular danger points are. Quite frankly, if your product suddenly starts killing people, it won't matter that you met all your requirements and you checked all your requirements. That will last for about 3 minutes, because people will appropriately, quite frankly, look at what you're doing and say, well, why didn't you evaluate this situation or that situation, and how could you have not considered this other particular risk in the product?
Yeah, my inclination is to share everything, but my training in regulated environments has this little word, whispering in my head that says GDP, right? Good documentation practices, which you're expected to follow and to be trained on. I think it's an annual interval at most places. You can't just throw an audit or scraps, and you have to remember that at times on some products, these materials, these test artifacts are kept for years, which leads you to a place where you want to have, I don't want to say clean, because our notes are not always necessarily perfectly clean documents to read. They might be kind of messy. They're written in the heat of the moment, but they do have to be able to stand up to an audit. Good documentation in lab notebooks, for instance. You can't tear out a page. You can't, you can't do certain things. You do have to keep that in mind. It is different from being in an environment where, maybe it's a web app and you're shipping a whole lot faster. So my inclination is to share, but I think you have to do that judiciously, and I think you have to make sure it's probably quality folks in your environment what meets GDP.
Yeah, that's usually
a great question here. Why can't you dry run the test scripts? This supports exploration, then approves tests, and run formal tests.
You can do that. The dry runs are, the intention of them is to find problems or confirm that the last run will go clean. So it reminds me of the minefield problem that's talked about, where what you're really doing is you're just, if you're following the same path through your product all the time, all you're doing is discovering the issues on that limited path. But unfortunately, your customers probably don't follow those paths all the time, or the people using your products. So I guess the question I would have, it's somewhat rhetorical to the program manager at that point. Do you feel comfortable putting this into a life-critical environment where you haven't actually ever made that assessment of how it would work off these non-scripted procedures? If you have to spend all your time making sure that the scripts work well and debug your scripts and debug the product through that process, then that suggests that there's some other issues in the organization that need to be addressed.
That's why I groaned. That was well said.
All right, we're starting to run on time here, so we're going to go to the next and final topic for our guest speakers, which is REST, the Workshop on Regulated Software Testing.
I can give an overview of this. Yes, what is 2007, Karen, I think, is when we had the first REST. There are quite a few of these types of workshops. We call them peer workshops, and they usually have some witty little acronym. But basically, the idea is that's participation. And we're glad SQE has kind of noticed this and invited us back quite a few times now to their conferences. We'll be doing, actually Griffin and I will be doing October 5th at Star West this year. The idea is just to get as many regulated testers together as we can that serves the group. So usually it's limited to about 20 people that we can effectively conduct a workshop. But really what we do is we tell stories. We'll get up, the participants actually contribute more than the hosts because we want to hear your stories, but we also want to collaborate and try to solve problems. So if you're interested in coming out to solve a problem, if you're local to the LA area, you can come for free on that Friday. So it's called a bonus session, so you don't have to attend the conference. But I think we found a lot of colleagues this way, and I think a lot of regulated testers have found a place where they can be heard and try to solve problems together.
Also, John, did you want to just add, there may be audience members that are not aware of Star West?
Sure. The STAR conferences, there's a STAR East and a STAR West. It stands for Software Testing Analysis and Review. it's probably the biggest and oldest conference for testing. They're actually doing Star Canada this year or next year, and there's a Eurostar. So they're getting worldwide now, but it's a fairly large conference. I've been to this one 2 or 3 times, and hey, it's Disneyland, so you can't go wrong there.
Yeah,
one thing I would add about REST was that we get people. We obviously have a lot of FDA regulated people, but we also get flight control people or financial people, also power industry people. So it's really interesting talking to all the people in these multiple different industries that are regulated and how things are common between them, some of the issues, and also some special stories from each of those different areas of industry.
And last time we did this was at the Better Software Conference in Las Vegas, and we spent maybe a couple hours just talking with a tester who had successfully implemented Agile in her regulated environment. And I thought it was fascinating. I think I learned more about Agile and regulated right there than any other time. So we get a lot of good conversations, and we've had articles published out of some of these. So I think it's a really productive workshop.
Yeah, John mentioned it comes from a whole chain of workshops. So the first one in that direction was LAWST. It's LAWST. You can Google for it. It stands for the Los Altos Workshop on Software Testing. I was actually a member of it. This was back in the late 90s. And there is a series. One of them is WHOPR, which is the workshop on performance and reliability. They're mostly performance testers, right, who get together a couple of times a year, keep the cost down really low. It doesn't feel like a conference at all. It's just, it's usually 15, 20 people in a room just jamming. WHOPR usually runs for like 3 days. John and I did something a little bit different with REST, where it's usually just restricted to a day. We don't charge people money. We don't make money. We won't take money from a tool vendor. It's just completely organic. We're just trying hard to get people together in the community to sit and talk about what the issues are. It's a lot like this, actually.
Yeah, it is.
With more technical difficulties, correct?
Right, as long as you can make it to the room, there shouldn't be any technical difficulties.
Okay, any last comments or feedback before we wrap up the open session?
Is there any burning questions coming across from chat?
Not currently. Everybody's probably digesting all the information.
There's one point on the slide I wanted to address. The mailing list for REST, it's a Yahoo group called REST Workshop. So it's spelled just the way it looks, WREST Workshop, at groups.yahoo.com. So if you would like to be on the mailing list, then you can get on there and sign up.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Karen, Griffin?
No, I'm good at this time.
Okay, what I'd like to do is thank you very much, Karen, Griffin, and John. It's a wonderful discussion, lots of insight.
Thank you for hosting.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Okay, so what we'll do is follow it up now is we'll do a brief overview of Chlorine QA and how it can possibly address some of the issues that we discussed today in the round table. Before I begin, what I'd like to actually say is that, again, I'd like to thank the guests for today's event. This is somewhat unique, having a challenging event with so many speakers basically distributed throughout North America. So again, I appreciate their time.
Thank you.
What I want to talk about is one particular product that we have at Polarian, which is Chlorine QA. And this is a web-based test management platform that allows you to manage all of your testing tools and activities from a central location. It's feature-rich, allows with all the rich features of like traceability, integration with your most popular testing tools, and it also comes with built-in pre-configured workflow and templates. What I would like to attempt to do currently is I'd like to actually go through some of the topics we had today briefly, and some suggested ways that Chlorine QA could hopefully alleviate, mitigate, and even attempt to address these particular issues. So the first was, can we test only with pre-written test cases? Well, with Chlorine QA, test cases can be written pretty much at any time during your process. Conversely, all your testing data can be transferred from Excel and Word. You can add your documents, you can create documents at any time during that process. Test automation. What about the test automation? With Chlorine QA, you can fully support pretty much any test automation software. Out of the box, our product actually supports all the XUnit and JUnit test automation frameworks. The process is that all your test automation results can be captured and managed within the Chlorine QA platform. What this obviously would do is it gives you recorded history in your repository and hopefully could satisfy your auditing requirements. Then we talked about regulated and agile. Chlorine QA is actually designed with the thought process of working within your environment rather than working within the software environment. What that means is that you get minimal interruption. Because it's highly customizable and flexible, you can define your user workflow. We can support pretty much any type of process. So whether you're using agile, waterfall, or as most people use, some kind of hybrid, we complement those particular processes. Just a couple more slides. What I want to talk about is further ways that, from a compliance and regulatory perspective, that you might want to think about with our particular product. We offer out-of-the-box predefined templates, and one of those particular templates that we offer is for FMEA risk mitigation processes. So, in essence, what you can do is you can have actually reusable templates that we offer or you can create. This would obviously save you time and avoid duplication, and also it can satisfy the requirements from regulatory perspective and your auditor's concerns. This example of risk assessment. Collaborations, obviously this is very important when you're dealing with both compliance and regulatory. As we mentioned before, everything is browser-based, and everybody can have access to all of the rich reports, automated notifications. So in essence, the entire team can know what's going on, what's been verified from a regulatory perspective, reduces your errors, and from an auditor's point of view, all your activities are captured and can be monitored. Traceability. We talked about traceability today. It's rich with traceability within our products. What is very unique within our products is the fact that everything is treated as an object. So whether it's a test case, you're doing exploratory testing, automation with the test result, all of those can be captured and easily linked to each other. So very important from an auditor's perspective. Workflow, we talked about this as well, but we do actually have a very highly customizable workflow which can be both automated and managed on a regular basis. So that in essence, if you have a workflow that you currently use, we can actually mimic that workflow. Or if you have that is dictated by a regulatory perspective, we have you can set the workflow so that there's minimal disruption with it. And then we have a series of other products as well in the Chlorine product family. We have a complete ALM offering, and our application lifecycle management is fully integrated with Chlorine QA, as well as we have a requirements management module, project management component, release planning, and build management components as well. Again, I thank the audience for attending today's very interactive event. If you have any questions whatsoever, we will actually have this. It's recorded. We will have it posted on our website. We'll probably send you a follow-up thank you email with details of how to contact our 3 guest panelists, as well as if you wanted to get more information on either their services or REST or any of our products. Thank you very much for attending today's very interactive and exciting event. Thank you.